December 25, 800 AD, 10:47 a.m., the Basilica of St. Peter, Rome. Charles, king of the Franks and Lombards, kneels before the ornate marble altar where centuries of Christian martyrs have been venerated, his massive frame draped in the purple silk robes of Roman imperial tradition. Pope Leo V, whose political survival has depended entirely on Frankish military protection, approaches with the golden corona that will transform this Germanic warrior king into Carolus Augustus, Emperor of the Romans, the first emperor to rule in Western Europe since the fall of Romulus Augustulus over 3 centuries earlier. As the crown settles upon Charles's graying head and the assembled Roman nobles cry out, Carolo Augusto, addio coronato magno et pacifico imperatori Romanorum vitae et victoria. The 48-year-old monarch rises to accept an authority that officially extends from the Atlantic shores of Iberia to the Elbe River plains of Saxony, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. In this moment of unprecedented political synthesis, as Christian Rome symbolically merges with Germanic military power to recreate the Western Roman Empire, Charles embodies the genetic culmination of over 25 generations of Frankish chieftains, Merovingian kings, and Germanic tribal leaders, whose accumulated political intelligence, military prowess, and administrative sophistication had been building toward precisely this restoration of imperial authority in Western Europe. Yet what Charles could never comprehend, as he accepts the imperial diadem that makes him the equal of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, is that coursing through his veins flows the concentrated leadership capabilities of nearly 8 centuries of Germanic tribal evolution, Frankish royal development, and Gallo-Roman administrative synthesis, a genetic inheritance that had been preparing his bloodline for the moment when barbarian military efficiency would be wedded to Roman imperial tradition to create the foundation for medieval European civilization. Who was Charlemagne really? From which ancient wellspring of tribal authority and imperial ambition did this transformative bloodline emerge? What Charles never realized, as he accepted the papal coronation that would legitimize his authority throughout Christian Europe, was that his capacity for military innovation, administrative organization, and cultural synthesis represented the flowering of genetic capabilities that had been accumulating since Germanic tribes first crossed the Rhine frontier and began their centuries-long transformation from barbarian raiders into the governing elite of post-Roman Europe. His paternal lineage carried the concentrated political acumen of Frankish mayors of the palace who had gradually usurped Merovingian royal authority through superior administrative competence and military effectiveness, while his deeper ancestry connected him to the Germanic tribal chieftains who had learned to adapt Roman governmental techniques to tribal social structures. The neurological architecture that enabled Charles to envision and implement the political, military, and cultural innovations that would define the Carolingian Renaissance had been forged through generations of ancestors who had mastered the arts of tribal leadership, military organization, and cross-cultural synthesis in the chaotic environment of post-imperial Europe. The man who would become history's greatest early medieval emperor was born Charles around April 2, 747, at an unknown location in the Frankish kingdom, the eldest son of a king whose own rise to power represented the culmination of centuries of Frankish political evolution. His father, Pepin the Short, born around 714, had inherited from his own ancestors the political intelligence necessary to complete the Carolingian family's gradual usurpation of Merovingian royal authority and to establish the institutional foundations for Frankish imperial expansion. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, hence his epithet, but possessing the muscular build and commanding presence that characterized Frankish military leadership, Pepin embodied the synthesis of Germanic tribal authority with Roman administrative sophistication that had been developing in his lineage for over 2 centuries. Pepin's revolutionary achievement in deposing the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, in 751, and securing papal approval for his coronation as King of the Franks, represented the culmination of political strategies that his ancestors had been developing since the early 7th century. His success in legitimizing Carolingian royal authority through ecclesiastical sanction demonstrated genetic memories of religious diplomacy and institutional innovation that would later enable his son Charles to achieve papal coronation as Roman emperor. Pepin's military campaigns against the Lombards in Italy and his donation of conquered territories to the Papal States established the political precedents that would facilitate Charles's later imperial coronation and his role as protector of the Roman Church. The Carolingian political genius that enabled Pepin to transform his family from palace officials into legitimate royalty descended from his father Charles Martel, born around 688, whose nickname the Hammer reflected both his devastating military effectiveness and his role in forging the political and military innovations that would make possible Frankish imperial expansion. Charles Martel's victory over Islamic forces at the Battle of Tours on October 10, 732, represented more than military triumph. It demonstrated the strategic intelligence and organizational capabilities that had been accumulating in the Carolingian lineage for generations and would later enable Charlemagne to organize and maintain imperial authority across vast territories populated by diverse ethnic and cultural groups. Charles Martel's rise to power as mayor of the palace reflected ancestral memories of administrative competence and political maneuvering that traced back through his father, Pepin of Herstal, born around 635, whose own consolidation of Carolingian authority over both Austrasia and Neustria had required exactly the kind of diplomatic sophistication and military coordination that would later characterize Charlemagne's imperial administration. Pepin of Herstal's marriage around 670 to Plectrude, a member of the powerful Austrasian aristocracy, represented the systematic alliance-building strategy that had enabled the Carolingian family to accumulate the territorial and political resources necessary for their eventual seizure of royal to Saint-Seminefit. The deeper Carolingian heritage traced back through Pepin of Herstal's father, Ansegisel, born around 602, whose marriage to Bega, daughter of Pepin the Elder, had united two of the most powerful Austrasian noble families and established the genetic foundation for Carolingian political dominance. Ansegisel's own political sophistication reflected ancestral memories of Frankish tribal leadership that extended back through the Merovingian period to the earliest Germanic settlements in Gaul, demonstrating genetic capabilities for tribal organization and military leadership that had been refined through centuries of political competition and territorial expansion. Ansegisel's ancestry connected the Carolingian lineage to the broader Germanic tribal aristocracy through his father, Arnold, born around 570, whose service as Bishop of Metz demonstrated the sophisticated integration of secular and religious authority that would later characterize Charlemagne's approach to imperial governance. Arnold's combination of ecclesiastical leadership with aristocratic political influence reflected genetic memories of cultural synthesis and institutional innovation that had been developing in his lineage since Germanic tribes first encountered Roman administrative practices and Christian religious institutions. The Germanic tribal heritage that flowed through Arnold's ancestry traced back through the complex migrations and political transformations that had brought Frankish tribes across the Rhine frontier and into the territories of the collapsing Western Roman Empire. Genealogical traditions preserved in Carolingian court chronicles connect Arnold's lineage to earlier Frankish chieftains, who had served as foederati under Roman authority while gradually establishing independent territorial control over significant portions of Gaul. The earliest documented ancestor in this tribal lineage appears to have been a Frankish chief named Clodio, who flourished around 430, and whose military campaigns had established Frankish control over territories between the Somme and Rhine rivers. Clodio's success in expanding Frankish territorial control, while maintaining diplomatic relationships with both Roman authorities and other Germanic tribes, demonstrated the strategic intelligence and cultural adaptability that would later enable his descendant Charlemagne to integrate diverse populations within a unified imperial structure. Claudio's own political sophistication reflected the accumulated tribal leadership capabilities that Germanic chieftains had been developing since their earliest encounters with Roman frontier administration. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Frankish tribes from which Claudio emerged had been involved in complex relationships with Roman authorities for over a century before his documented military campaigns, developing a sophisticated understanding of Roman administrative practices and military organization that would prove essential to their eventual dominance in post-Roman Gaul. The pre-Frankish Germanic ancestry that contributed to Charlemagne's genetic inheritance can be traced through legendary and semi-historical sources to tribal leaders who had participated in the great Germanic migrations of the 3rd and 4th centuries. These ancestors had developed the political and military capabilities necessary to organize tribal confederations, conduct long-distance military campaigns, and establish territorial control over populations that included both Germanic settlers and conquered Roman provincials. The maternal side of Charlemagne's inheritance proved equally significant through his mother Bertrada of Laon, born around 720, whose own ancestry connected the Carolingian dynasty to other powerful Frankish noble families, and brought additional genetic memories of political sophistication and administrative competence. Bertrada's marriage to Pepin the Short around 744 represented more than romantic attraction. It was a calculated political alliance that strengthened Carolingian legitimacy and expanded their territorial influence through her family's existing political networks. Bertrada's political intelligence and her influence over Carolingian policy decisions reflected her inheritance from ancestors who had been major players in Frankish politics since the Merovingian period. Her father, Charibert of Laon, born around 690, had maintained significant territorial control in northern France and had developed the administrative capabilities necessary to govern diverse populations effectively, while preserving Frankish cultural identity and political independence. The Laon noble heritage that Bertrada brought to the Carolingian lineage traced back through families who had been involved in Frankish territorial expansion and administrative development since the 6th century. Her ancestors had learned to balance the competing demands of tribal leadership and territorial administration, developing a sophisticated understanding of how Germanic social structures could be adapted to govern settled agricultural populations and urban communities inherited from Roman administration. The convergence of these diverse Frankish noble lineages in Charlemagne's genetic inheritance created a neurological architecture uniquely equipped for the challenges of early medieval imperial governance. From his Carolingian paternal ancestors, he inherited the political intelligence and administrative competence necessary to organize and maintain governmental authority over vast territories and diverse populations. From his maternal Laon heritage, he inherited additional genetic memories of diplomatic sophistication and cultural synthesis that would prove essential to his success in integrating Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements within a unified imperial structure. The physical characteristics that made Charlemagne such an imposing figure reflected his diverse Germanic ancestry in remarkable ways. Contemporary sources describe him as exceptionally tall, probably around 6 feet 4 inches, with broad shoulders, a powerful build, and the long limbs that characterized Germanic tribal aristocracy. His fair hair and blue eyes reflected the typical coloring of Frankish nobility, while his commanding presence and natural authority demonstrated genetic traits that had been refined through centuries of tribal leadership and military command. The intellectual capabilities that enabled Charlemagne to master the complex governmental, military, and cultural challenges of imperial administration reflected accumulated educational advantages that his ancestors had been developing for generations. The Carolingian tradition of scholarly kingship, established through their early patronage of monastic schools and ecclesiastical learning, had created genetic memories of intellectual curiosity and educational achievement that complemented the practical political intelligence inherited from tribal ancestors. The linguistic abilities that enabled Charlemagne to communicate effectively with diverse populations throughout his empire reflected genetic memories of multilingual competence that had been essential to his ancestors' political success. Frankish nobles had maintained their Germanic tribal language while mastering Latin for administrative purposes and developing competence in various Romance languages that were evolving from vulgar Latin in different regions of their territories. This ancestral linguistic sophistication provided Charlemagne with the cognitive foundation necessary to govern an empire that included speakers of Germanic, Romance, Celtic, and Slavic languages. The military genius that characterized Charlemagne's approach to warfare reflected genetic memories of tactical innovation and strategic planning that had been accumulating in his ancestry for centuries. His Germanic ancestors had developed a sophisticated understanding of cavalry, warfare, siege techniques, and the logistical requirements for conducting military campaigns across vast distances and difficult terrain. The synthesis of these tribal military traditions with Roman engineering capabilities and administrative organization enabled Charlemagne to conduct the complex military campaigns that would expand Frankish authority from the Atlantic to the Elbe River and from the North Sea to central Italy. The administrative sophistication that enabled Charlemagne to govern his vast empire reflected genetic memories of governmental innovation and bureaucratic development that his ancestors had been accumulating since their first encounters with Roman administrative practices. Frankish nobles had learned to adapt Roman bureaucratic techniques to Germanic social structures, developing hybrid administrative systems that could maintain central authority while accommodating local customs and traditional leadership patterns. This ancestral administrative knowledge provided Charlemagne with the institutional framework necessary to govern diverse populations effectively, while maintaining political unity across vast geographic distances. The religious sophistication that characterized Charlemagne's approach to ecclesiastical affairs reflected genetic memories of Christian conversion and theological understanding that had been building in his ancestry since the Frankish kingdoms first accepted Christian authority in the 5th and 6th centuries. His ancestors had learned to balance traditional Germanic religious practices with Christian theological requirements, developing a sophisticated understanding of how religious authority could be integrated with secular political power to create more effective governmental systems. The cultural intelligence that enabled Charlemagne to sponsor and direct the Carolingian Renaissance reflected genetic memories of artistic patronage and intellectual achievement that had been accumulating in his lineage through their involvement with Christian monastic institutions and classical laissez. Roman cultural traditions. His ancestors had preserved and transmitted classical learning through the chaotic centuries of Germanic invasion and settlement, developing a sophisticated understanding of how cultural achievements could serve political purposes and enhance royal legitimacy. The economic sophistication that enabled Charlemagne to manage the fiscal requirements of imperial administration reflected genetic memories of resource management and commercial organization that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with post-Roman economic reconstruction. Frankish nobles had learned to maintain agricultural productivity while developing the commercial and manufacturing capabilities necessary to support military campaigns and administrative expansion. The diplomatic intelligence that characterized Charlemagne's international relations reflected genetic memories of alliance building and cultural mediation that had been essential to his ancestors' political success. Frankish leaders had maintained complex relationships with Byzantine authorities, papal administration, Islamic powers in Iberia, and various Germanic and Slavic tribes, developing a sophisticated understanding of how diplomatic protocol and cultural sensitivity could facilitate political objectives and military success. The legal sophistication that enabled Charlemagne to create and promulgate the capitularies reflected genetic memories of juridical innovation and constitutional development that had been building in his ancestry since Germanic tribal law first encountered Roman legal principles. His ancestors had developed hybrid legal systems that incorporated elements of tribal customary law with Roman administrative regulations, creating institutional precedents for the comprehensive legal reforms that would characterize Charlemagne's imperial administration. The architectural and engineering capabilities that enabled Charlemagne to sponsor monumental building projects reflected genetic memories of construction knowledge and aesthetic appreciation that his ancestors had been accumulating through their involvement with Roman architectural traditions and Germanic craft specialization. The palace complex at Aachen and the various churches and monasteries built during his reign demonstrated an inherited understanding of engineering principles and artistic design that combined Germanic cultural preferences with classical Roman architectural techniques. The monetary reforms that Charlemagne implemented reflected genetic memories of economic administration and commercial regulation that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with post-Roman economic reconstruction. His standardization of weights, measures, and currency demonstrated an inherited understanding of how economic policy could facilitate trade and commercial development while enhancing imperial authority and fiscal resources. The military innovations that characterized Charlemagne's armed forces reflected genetic memories of tactical development and organizational excellence that had been building in his ancestry since Germanic warriors first encountered Roman military techniques. His development of heavy cavalry forces and his integration of infantry tactics with siege warfare demonstrated inherited capabilities for military innovation and strategic adaptation that enabled Frankish forces to maintain superiority over diverse enemies across varied geographic and tactical environments. The fortification programs that Charlemagne sponsored reflected genetic memories of defensive architecture and military engineering that his ancestors had been accumulating through their involvement with Roman frontier systems and Germanic tribal fortifications. His construction of fortified palaces and defensive installations demonstrated an inherited understanding of how architectural design could serve both military and political purposes, while projecting royal authority and enhancing administrative effectiveness. The cultural synthesis that characterized the Carolingian Renaissance reflected genetic memories of intellectual integration and artistic innovation that had been building in Charlemagne's ancestry through centuries of cross-cultural interaction. His patronage of classical learning, Christian scholarship, and artistic production demonstrated inherited capabilities for cultural leadership and aesthetic appreciation that could facilitate political legitimacy while preserving and transmitting essential intellectual traditions. The manuscript preservation and reproduction programs that Charlemagne sponsored reflected genetic memories of educational administration and intellectual preservation that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with Christian monastic institutions. His support for scriptoria and libraries demonstrated an inherited understanding of how intellectual resources could serve political purposes while preserving cultural achievements for future generations. The palace school that Charlemagne established at Aachen reflected genetic memories of educational innovation and scholarly administration that had been accumulating in his ancestry through their involvement with ecclesiastical learning and classical education. His recruitment of scholars from across Europe and his personal participation in educational activities demonstrated inherited capabilities for intellectual leadership and pedagogical administration that could enhance royal authority while advancing cultural development. The religious reforms that Charlemagne implemented throughout his empire reflected genetic memories of ecclesiastical administration and theological sophistication that had been building in his ancestry since Frankish conversion to Christianity. His standardization of liturgical practices and his support for monastic reform demonstrated an inherited understanding of how religious authority could be integrated with secular political power to create more effective governmental systems and enhance imperial legitimacy. The missionary activities that Charlemagne sponsored in Saxon territories and Slavic frontier regions reflected genetic memories of religious expansion and cultural transformation that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with Christian conversion and territorial conquest. His systematic implementation of Christianization programs demonstrated inherited capabilities for cultural synthesis and religious administration that could facilitate political integration while eliminating sources of cultural resistance and political opposition. The juridical innovations that Charlemagne implemented through his capitularies reflected genetic memories of legal development and constitutional administration that had been accumulating in his ancestry since Germanic tribal law first encountered Roman legal principles. His creation of comprehensive legal codes and his standardization of judicial procedures demonstrated an inherited understanding of how legal authority could serve political purposes while maintaining social order and facilitating economic development. The commercial policies that Charlemagne implemented reflected genetic memories of economic administration and trade regulation that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with post-Roman commercial reconstruction. His support for merchant activities and his regulation of market relationships demonstrated an inherited understanding of how economic policy could enhance imperial revenues while facilitating cultural exchange and technological development. The diplomatic achievements that characterized Charlemagne's international relations reflected genetic memories of alliance building and cultural mediation that had been essential to his ancestors' political success. His maintenance of complex relationships with Byzantine emperors, Islamic rulers in Iberia, and various tribal confederations demonstrated inherited capabilities for diplomatic protocol and cultural sensitivity that could serve imperial interests while maintaining political stability and territorial security. The correspondence that Charlemagne maintained with Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, represented one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the early medieval period, and demonstrated inherited capabilities for cross-cultural communication and political coordination that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. Their exchange of embassies and gifts reflected genetic memories of diplomatic sophistication and cultural appreciation that enabled effective international relations despite fundamental differences in religious belief and political organization. The relationship that Charlemagne developed with the Byzantine Empire reflected genetic memories of diplomatic complexity and political coordination that had been building in his ancestry through their involvement with Eastern Roman administration and cultural exchange. His assumption of the imperial title and his negotiations regarding the political status of imperial authority demonstrated an inherited understanding of how diplomatic protocol could serve political purposes while maintaining international stability and facilitating cultural cooperation. The Frankish royal authority that Charlemagne inherited from his father Pepin the Short represented the culmination of over 2 centuries of Carolingian political development and institutional innovation. His expansion of this authority into imperial dominion demonstrated genetic capabilities for political vision and administrative organization that could transform regional kingship into a continental empire, while maintaining governmental effectiveness and political legitimacy. The papal relationship that enabled Charlemagne's imperial coronation represented the culmination of diplomatic policies that his ancestors had been developing since the Frankish kingdoms first accepted responsibility for papal protection. His coordination of secular and ecclesiastical authority demonstrated an inherited understanding of how religious legitimacy could enhance political power while serving broader cultural and institutional purposes. The imperial administration that Charlemagne developed represented a revolutionary synthesis of Germanic tribal organization, Roman bureaucratic techniques, and Christian ecclesiastical structures that would provide the governmental foundation for medieval European political development. His creation of administrative systems that could govern diverse populations across vast geographic distances demonstrated genetic capabilities for institutional innovation and political organization that had been accumulating in his ancestry for centuries. The succession arrangements that Charlemagne implemented for the transmission of imperial authority reflected genetic memories of dynastic planning and constitutional development that his ancestors had been refining through their involvement with Frankish royal succession and territorial administration. His division of imperial territories among his sons demonstrated an inherited understanding of how political authority could be preserved across generational transitions while maintaining territorial integrity and administrative continuity. The legal legacy that Charlemagne established through his capitularies would influence European juridical development for centuries, creating constitutional precedents and administrative procedures that would shape medieval political institutions and legal traditions. His systematic approach to legal reform demonstrated genetic capabilities for constitutional innovation and juridical administration that had been building in his ancestry through centuries of tribal leadership and territorial governance. The cultural impact that Charlemagne achieved through his patronage of learning and artistic production would establish intellectual foundations for medieval European civilization that would influence cultural development for centuries. His support for classical education and Christian scholarship demonstrated genetic memories of intellectual leadership and cultural administration that could serve political purposes while preserving and transmitting essential cultural achievements. The economic transformation that occurred during Charlemagne's reign would establish commercial and agricultural foundations for medieval European prosperity that would facilitate population growth and territorial expansion for centuries. His monetary reforms and commercial policies demonstrated an inherited understanding of how economic administration could serve political purposes while enhancing material prosperity and technological development. The military innovations that Charlemagne introduced would influence European warfare for centuries, establishing tactical and organizational precedents that would shape medieval military development and contribute to European expansion and technological advancement. His development of heavy cavalry forces and siege warfare techniques demonstrated genetic memories of military innovation and strategic planning that had been refined through centuries of Germanic tribal warfare and Roman military experience. The architectural achievements that Charlemagne sponsored would influence European building traditions for centuries, establishing aesthetic standards and engineering techniques that would shape medieval architectural development and cultural expression. His palace complex at Aachen and his church construction programs demonstrated inherited capabilities for artistic vision and architectural administration that could serve both political and spiritual purposes while preserving and advancing cultural traditions. The territorial integration that Charlemagne achieved would establish geographic foundations for European political development that would influence continental unity and cultural exchange for centuries. His creation of imperial administrative systems that could govern diverse populations demonstrated genetic capabilities for political organization and cultural synthesis that had been accumulating in his ancestry through centuries of tribal leadership and territorial expansion. As Charlemagne rose from his knees in St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day 800, accepting the imperial crown that would make him the first emperor of the West since the collapse of Roman authority, he embodied the culmination of over 25 generations of genetic and cultural evolution that had been preparing Germanic tribal leadership for precisely this moment of imperial restoration and European unification. His acceptance of imperial authority represented not only his individual political achievement, but also the flowering of genetic capabilities that had been accumulating since Germanic tribes first crossed the Rhine frontier and began their transformation into the governing elite of post-Roman Europe. The constitutional innovations that would emerge from Charlemagne's imperial administration would establish political precedents for European governmental development that would influence continental political evolution for centuries. His synthesis of Germanic tribal authority with Roman imperial tradition and Christian ecclesiastical legitimacy would create new possibilities for political organization and cultural integration that would shape medieval European civilization and establish foundations for modern European political development. The intellectual revolution that Charlemagne sponsored through the Carolingian Renaissance would establish educational and cultural foundations for European learning that would facilitate the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge while creating new possibilities for scholarly achievement and cultural advancement. His patronage of monastic schools and classical education would influence European intellectual development for centuries and would establish institutional frameworks for the educational innovations that would characterize later medieval and Renaissance cultural development. The religious transformation that Charlemagne achieved through his integration of secular and ecclesiastical authority would establish precedents for European political and spiritual development that would influence the relationship between temporal and religious power for centuries. His coordination of imperial administration with Christian missionary activity would create new possibilities for cultural synthesis and spiritual development that would shape medieval European religious evolution. The man who had transformed Germanic tribal kingship into Christian imperial authority carried within his cellular structure the concentrated political wisdom of centuries of tribal leadership and cultural adaptation. His extraordinary achievement would establish new paradigms for European political organization and would demonstrate that genetic capabilities accumulated over generations could enable individual leaders to create institutional innovations that would influence continental development for centuries. The international influence that Charlemagne's empire would achieve would establish precedents for European expansion and cultural exchange that would shape world history for centuries. His creation of diplomatic relationships with Byzantine, Islamic and tribal powers would demonstrate new possibilities for international cooperation and cultural communication that would influence global political development and establish foundations for European maritime expansion and colonial development. The technological and economic advancement that occurred during Charlemagne's reign would establish the foundations for European prosperity and innovation that would facilitate population growth, territorial expansion, and cultural development for centuries. His administrative and commercial policies would create institutional frameworks for economic development that would enable European societies to achieve levels of prosperity and technological sophistication that would ultimately facilitate European global expansion and cultural influence. The dynasty that Charlemagne established would influence European political development for centuries, creating precedents for imperial authority and territorial organization that would shape continental political evolution and establish foundations for the complex political relationships that would characterize medieval and early modern European development. His constitutional innovations would influence European governmental traditions and would establish institutional frameworks for political development that would ultimately contribute to modern European political integration and international cooperation. The bloodline that had begun with Germanic tribal chieftains crossing the Rhine frontier and establishing territorial control over post-Roman Gaul would reach its ultimate expression in imperial achievements that continue to influence European political development and demonstrate the unlimited potential for political innovation and cultural synthesis that lies dormant within every ruling family's genetic inheritance, waiting for the right combination of historical circumstance, personal determination, and ancestral preparation to release capabilities that can reshape not only individual nations, but the entire trajectory of continental political development, and establish foundations for cultural advancement and international cooperation that transcend the limitations of tribal identity. Regional conflict and traditional political boundaries to create new possibilities for human development and civilizational achievement. The imperial coronation that had just transformed Charles from a Germanic king into a Roman emperor would reverberate throughout European consciousness for centuries, establishing new conceptions of political authority that would influence continental development long after the Carolingian dynasty itself had fragmented into competing territorial principalities. The genetic inheritance that had enabled this moment of political synthesis would continue to influence European royal families through the complex web of marital alliances and dynastic connections that would spread Carolingian blood throughout the medieval European aristocracy. The immediate aftermath of Charlemagne's coronation revealed the sophisticated political intelligence that he had inherited from his ancestors in his careful management of the constitutional implications of imperial authority. His initial profession of surprise at the papal coronation, whether genuine or calculated, demonstrated genetic memories of diplomatic sophistication that recognized the importance of maintaining political flexibility while accepting unprecedented authority. The delicate balance he would maintain between imperial prerogatives and papal independence reflected an ancestral understanding of how religious legitimacy could enhance political power without compromising governmental autonomy. The administrative systems that Charlemagne would develop to govern his vast empire represented the culmination of genetic capabilities for institutional innovation that had been accumulating in his lineage for centuries. His creation of the Missi Dominici, royal envoys who traveled throughout the empire to ensure administrative compliance and judicial consistency, demonstrated an inherited understanding of how central authority could be maintained across vast distances while accommodating local customs and traditional leadership patterns. These administrative innovations drew upon ancestral memories of Germanic tribal organization, Roman bureaucratic efficiency, and Christian ecclesiastical hierarchy to create governmental systems that could function effectively across diverse cultural and geographic environments. The capitulary legislation that Charlemagne would promulgate throughout his reign reflected genetic memories of juridical innovation and constitutional development that his ancestors had been accumulating since Germanic tribal law first encountered Roman legal principles. His systematic codification of administrative procedures, judicial protocols, and economic regulations demonstrated inherited capabilities for legal reasoning and institutional design that could create comprehensive governmental frameworks while preserving essential elements of traditional custom and local autonomy. The Capitulary of Villas, which detailed the administration of royal estates, revealed a sophisticated understanding of agricultural management and economic organization that reflected ancestral experiences with land tenure and resource administration. The military campaigns that would define much of Charlemagne's reign demonstrated the full flowering of genetic capabilities for strategic planning and tactical innovation that had been building in his ancestry for centuries. The Saxon Wars, which would consume 32 years of intermittent fighting from 772 to 804, required exactly the kind of persistent strategic vision and logistical sophistication that his Germanic ancestors had been developing through centuries of tribal warfare and territorial expansion. His ability to maintain military pressure against Saxon resistance, while simultaneously conducting campaigns in Italy, Spain, and Bavaria, demonstrated inherited capabilities for multiple front warfare and resource coordination that exceeded anything achieved by earlier Germanic leaders. The Siege of Paderborn in 785, where Charlemagne established one of his most important administrative centers in Saxon territory, exemplified the genetic synthesis of military conquest and administrative innovation that characterized his approach to territorial expansion. His construction of fortified palaces and administrative complexes in newly conquered territories reflected ancestral memories of Roman frontier administration, combined with the Germanic understanding of tribal territorial control. These installations served simultaneously as military strongholds administrative centers, and symbols of imperial authority that could facilitate cultural integration while maintaining political control. The cultural transformation that Charlemagne would achieve through his patronage of learning and artistic production represented the culmination of genetic tendencies toward intellectual leadership and aesthetic appreciation that had been building in his ancestry through centuries of cross-cultural interaction. The palace school at Aachen, where he would gather scholars from across Europe to preserve and transmit classical learning, demonstrated an inherited understanding of how intellectual achievement could serve political purposes while advancing cultural development. His personal participation in scholarly activities, including his efforts to learn to read, despite the challenges this presented for an adult who had been educated primarily in oral traditions, reflected genetic memories of educational innovation and intellectual curiosity. The scholars who gathered at Charlemagne's court, including Alcuin of York, Einhard, Paul the Deacon, and Theodulf of Orleans, represented the most sophisticated intellectual talent available in contemporary Europe, and their collaborative efforts would establish educational and cultural foundations that would influence European development for centuries. The Carolingian Renaissance that emerged from their work would preserve classical Latin literature, standardize liturgical practices, develop new forms of manuscript illumination, and create educational curricula that would shape medieval European intellectual development. This cultural achievement reflected genetic capabilities for scholarly patronage and intellectual administration that had been accumulating in Charlemagne's ancestry through their involvement with Christian monastic institutions and classical Roman educational traditions. The palace complex at Aachen, that Charlemagne would construct as his primary residence, represented one of the most ambitious architectural projects of the early medieval period, and demonstrated inherited capabilities for engineering vision and aesthetic sophistication that combined Germanic cultural preferences with classical Roman architectural techniques. The Palatine Chapel, modeled on San Vitale in Ravenna but incorporating distinctive Carolingian modifications, reflected genetic memories of monumental construction and artistic patronage that could serve both political and spiritual purposes while projecting imperial authority and cultural sophistication. The throne room in the Aachen Palace, where Charlemagne would hold court and receive embassies from across the known world, was designed to evoke memories of Roman imperial audience chambers while incorporating Germanic symbols and Christian religious imagery. The sophisticated coordination of architectural elements, decorative programs, and ceremonial protocols demonstrated an inherited understanding of how physical environments could enhance political authority while facilitating administrative efficiency and cultural communication. The diplomatic correspondence that Charlemagne would maintain with powers throughout Europe and beyond reflected genetic memories of international relations and cultural mediation that had been essential to his ancestors' political success. His famous exchange of embassies with Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, represented one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the medieval period and demonstrated inherited capabilities for cross-cultural communication that could transcend religious and cultural boundaries to establish mutually beneficial political relationships. The gifts that Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid exchanged, including the famous elephant Abul Abbas that the Caliph sent to the Frankish court, symbolized the sophisticated understanding of diplomatic protocol and cultural appreciation that characterized their relationship. The technical and artistic sophistication of these diplomatic gifts reflected genetic memories of international commerce and cultural exchange that enabled effective communication across vast cultural and geographical distances. The practical benefits of this diplomatic relationship, including intelligence sharing and mutual security arrangements, demonstrated an inherited understanding of how international cooperation could serve imperial interests while facilitating cultural and technological exchange. The relationship that Charlemagne would develop with the Byzantine Empire represented one of the most complex diplomatic challenges of his reign. and required exactly the kind of sophisticated political intelligence that his ancestors had been developing through centuries of interaction with diverse political and cultural systems. The Byzantine refusal to recognize Charlemagne's imperial title initially created significant diplomatic tensions, but his patient cultivation of Byzantine interests and his willingness to negotiate territorial and ceremonial arrangements ultimately resulted in Byzantine recognition of his imperial authority through the Treaty of Aachen in 812. The marriage negotiations that Charlemagne would conduct for his daughters revealed a sophisticated understanding of how matrimonial diplomacy could serve imperial interests while maintaining dynastic security and cultural influence. His decision to keep his daughters unmarried and at court, rather than using them to cement foreign alliances, reflected genetic memories of dynastic planning and political calculation that prioritized immediate administrative advantages over potential long-term diplomatic benefits. This approach demonstrated an inherited understanding of how personal relationships and family loyalty could enhance imperial authority, while preserving flexibility for future diplomatic initiatives. The succession planning that would occupy much of Charlemagne's later reign reflected genetic memories of constitutional administration and dynastic preservation that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with Frankish royal succession and territorial governance. His initial division of imperial territories among his three sons in 806, and his subsequent revision of these arrangements following the deaths of Pepin and Charles to concentrate authority in Louis the Pious, demonstrated an inherent understanding of how imperial authority could be preserved across generational transitions while maintaining territorial integrity and administrative continuity. The Divisio Regnorum of 806, which outlined Charlemagne's original succession plans, revealed a sophisticated understanding of political geography and administrative organization that reflected ancestral experiences with territorial management and governmental coordination. His careful delineation of boundaries, administrative responsibilities, and resource allocation demonstrated genetic capabilities for constitutional planning and institutional design that could maintain imperial unity while accommodating the personal ambitions and territorial interests of his successors. The educational reforms that Charlemagne would implement throughout his empire represented a revolutionary expansion of learning opportunities that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. His mandate that all monasteries and cathedral chapters establish schools demonstrated an inherited understanding of how educational policy could serve imperial interests while advancing cultural development and administrative efficiency. The curriculum standards that he established, emphasizing classical Latin literature, Christian theology, and practical administrative skills, reflected genetic memories of educational excellence and intellectual achievement that could facilitate governmental competence while preserving essential cultural traditions. The standardization of liturgical practices that Charlemagne would achieve throughout his empire reflected genetic memories of religious administration and institutional coordination that could serve both spiritual and political purposes. His imposition of Roman liturgical forms and his support for monastic reform demonstrated an inherited understanding of how religious uniformity could enhance imperial authority while facilitating cultural integration and administrative efficiency. The Admonitio Generalis of 789, which outlined his program for ecclesiastical reform, revealed a sophisticated understanding of religious law and theological principles that reflected ancestral experiences with Christian conversion and institutional development. The monetary reforms that Charlemagne would implement reflected genetic memories of economic administration and commercial regulation that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with post-Roman economic reconstruction. His establishment of the silver standard and his standardization of weights and measures demonstrated an inherited understanding of how economic policy could facilitate trade and commercial development while enhancing imperial revenues and administrative efficiency. The new coinage that bore his imperial title and image served both practical commercial purposes and symbolic political functions, projecting imperial authority while facilitating economic exchange across vast territorial distances. The agricultural innovations that would be promoted during Charlemagne's reign reflected genetic memories of land management and rural administration that his ancestors had been accumulating through their involvement with Frankish territorial expansion and settlement. The three-field system that became widespread during this period, along with improved plowing techniques and crop rotation practices, demonstrated an inherited understanding of how agricultural productivity could be enhanced to support population growth and economic development. These innovations would provide the economic foundation for European demographic expansion and territorial development that would characterize the later medieval period. The technological advancement that occurred during Charlemagne's reign reflected genetic memories of innovation and mechanical expertise that had been building in his ancestry through their involvement with both Germanic craft traditions and Roman engineering techniques. The improvements in metallurgy, construction techniques, and manufacturing processes that characterized the Carolingian period demonstrated inherited capabilities for technological synthesis and practical application that could serve both military and civilian purposes while advancing cultural innovations. Development and economic prosperity. The manuscript production and preservation programs that Charlemagne would sponsor represented one of his most enduring cultural achievements and reflected genetic memories of intellectual preservation and scholarly administration that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with Christian monastic institutions. The Scriptorium at Tours, under the direction of Alcuin, would produce some of the finest manuscript illuminations of the medieval period while preserving classical texts that might otherwise have been lost. This cultural achievement demonstrated an inherited understanding of how intellectual resources could serve political purposes while advancing scholarly achievement and cultural development. The development of Carolingian minuscule script during this period represented a revolutionary advance in manuscript production that would influence European literary culture for centuries. This standardized writing system, which combined clarity and efficiency with aesthetic appeal, demonstrated genetic capabilities for practical innovation and artistic achievement that could serve both administrative and cultural purposes. The widespread adoption of this script throughout the empire reflected an inherited understanding of how cultural standardization could facilitate administrative efficiency while preserving intellectual tradition. The legal codification that Charlemagne would achieve through his systematic promulgation of capitulary legislation represented one of the most comprehensive attempts at legal reform in medieval European history. His integration of Germanic customary law with Roman legal principles and Christian theological concepts created hybrid legal systems that could maintain social order while accommodating diverse cultural traditions and local customs. This juridical achievement reflected genetic memories of constitutional development and legal innovation that had been accumulating in his ancestry since Germanic tribal law first encountered Roman administrative practices. The judicial administration that Charlemagne would establish throughout his empire demonstrated an inherited understanding of how legal authority could serve political purposes while maintaining social stability and cultural integration. His creation of standardized court procedures and his establishment of appellate systems demonstrated genetic capabilities for institutional design and administrative coordination that could ensure consistent application of legal principles while preserving local autonomy and cultural diversity. The military innovations that Charlemagne would introduce would revolutionize European warfare and establish tactical precedents that would influence military development for centuries. His systematic development of heavy cavalry forces, combined with improved siege warfare techniques and enhanced logistical capabilities, created military advantages that enabled Frankish forces to maintain superiority over diverse enemies across varied geographic and tactical environments. These military innovations reflected genetic memories of tactical development and strategic planning that had been refined through centuries of Germanic tribal warfare and Roman military experience. The fortification programs that Charlemagne would sponsor throughout his empire demonstrated an inherited understanding of defensive architecture and military engineering that could serve both strategic and political purposes. His construction of fortified palaces, defensive installations, and frontier fortifications created a comprehensive system of territorial control that could maintain imperial security while projecting royal authority and facilitating administrative coordination. These architectural achievements reflected genetic capabilities for engineering vision and construction management that combined Germanic understanding of tribal territorial control with Roman expertise in frontier administration. The commercial policies that Charlemagne would implement reflected genetic memories of economic administration and trade regulation that his ancestors had been developing through their involvement with post-Roman commercial reconstruction. His support for merchant activities, his regulation of market relationships, and his establishment of commercial standards demonstrated an inherited understanding of how economic policy could enhance imperial revenues while facilitating cultural exchange and technological development. His coordination of tribal leadership traditions with imperial administrative systems and Christian spiritual authority demonstrated genetic capabilities for institutional innovation and cultural integration that could preserve essential elements of diverse traditions while creating unified Hiki.